زینب ایک خوبصورت اور معصوم لڑکی تھی جو ایک چھوٹے سے گاؤں میں رہتی تھی۔ اس کی زندگی سادگی اور خوشیوں سے بھری ہوئی تھی۔ وہ اپنے والدین کی اکلوتی بیٹی تھی، اس لیے وہ اس سے بے پناہ محبت کرتے تھے۔ زینب کے والدین ہمیشہ چاہتے تھے کہ ان کی بیٹی ایک خوشگوار زندگی گزارے۔ ان کی زندگی کا سب سے بڑا خواب زینب کی شادی تھی، اور یہ خواب اس وقت پورا ہوتا دکھائی دیا جب انہوں نے زینب کے بچپن کے دوست عمران سے اس کا رشتہ طے کیا۔ عمران زینب کا پڑوسی تھا اور دونوں بچپن سے ایک دوسرے کے بہترین دوست تھے۔ ان کی دوستی وقت کے ساتھ ایک مضبوط رشتے میں بدل گئی تھی، اور جب ان کے نکاح کی بات ہوئی تو دونوں خاندانوں نے اسے خوش دلی سے قبول کیا۔ نکاح کی تاریخ مقرر ہو گئی اور گاؤں بھر میں خوشی کی لہر دوڑ گئی۔ زینب اور عمران دونوں بہت خوش تھے اور اپنی نئی زندگی کے خواب دیکھ رہے تھے۔ زینب کا دل نئی امیدوں اور خوشیوں سے بھرا ہوا تھا۔ نکاح سے صرف چند دن پہلے عمران کو شہر جانا پڑا۔ وہ کام کے سلسلے میں روانہ ہوا اور وعدہ کیا کہ جلدی واپس آ جائے گا۔ لیکن جب شام تک عمران واپس نہ آیا تو سب کو فکر ہونے لگی۔ گاؤں والوں نے ہر جگہ تلاش کی لیکن عمران کا کوئی پتہ نہ چلا۔ کئی دن گزر گئے اور عمران کا کوئی سراغ نہ ملا۔ گاؤں والوں نے مان لیا کہ عمران کسی حادثے کا شکار ہو گیا ہے یا شاید گم ہو گیا ہے۔ زینب کے والدین کے لیے یہ ایک بہت بڑی آزمائش تھی۔ وہ اپنی بیٹی کی عزت اور مستقبل کے بارے میں فکر مند تھے اور فیصلہ کیا کہ زینب کا نکاح کسی اور سے کر دیا جائے تاکہ وہ معاشرتی دباؤ سے بچ سکے۔ کچھ دن بعد زینب کا نکاح عثمان نامی ایک شریف انسان سے کر دیا گیا جو حال ہی میں گاؤں میں آباد ہوا تھا۔ عثمان ایک نیک دل اور سمجھدار شخص تھا۔ اس نے زینب کے ساتھ محبت اور عزت کے ساتھ زندگی گزارنے کا وعدہ کیا۔ زینب نے اپنے دل کو سمجھانے کی بہت کوشش کی اور نئی زندگی کو قبول کرنے کی راہ پر گامزن ہو گئی۔ لیکن عمران کی یادیں اس کا پیچھا نہیں چھوڑ رہی تھیں۔ وہ راتوں کو جاگ کر سوچتی کہ عمران کہاں ہوگا، کس حال میں ہوگا، کیا وہ زندہ ہے؟ عثمان نے زینب کے دل کی کیفیت کو محسوس کیا لیکن کبھی اس سے کچھ نہیں پوچھا۔ وہ چاہتا تھا کہ زینب کو وقت دیا جائے تاکہ وہ اپنے زخموں کو بھر سکے۔ چند مہینے گزرے اور زینب نے آہستہ آہستہ اپنی نئی زندگی کے ساتھ سمجھوتا کر لیا۔ عثمان نے اپنی محبت اور صبر کے ذریعے زینب کا دل جیتنے کی کوشش کی۔ زینب کو لگنے لگا کہ شاید قسمت نے اسے ایک بہتر راستہ دکھایا ہے اور اس نے اپنی زندگی کو نئے سرے سے شروع کرنے کا فیصلہ کیا۔ لیکن قسمت کا کھیل عجیب تھا۔ ایک دن گاؤں میں اچانک ایک غیر معمولی واقعہ ہوا۔ عمران زندہ واپس آ گیا۔ وہ گاؤں کے چوک میں کھڑا تھا، تھکا ہوا اور کمزور لیکن زندہ۔ گاؤں والوں نے اسے گھیر لیا اور سوالات کرنے لگے۔ عمران نے بتایا کہ وہ شہر جاتے ہوئے ایک حادثے کا شکار ہو گیا تھا اور کئی مہینے بے ہوش رہا۔ جب وہ ہوش میں آیا تو اسے اپنی شناخت اور گاؤں کا پتہ یاد آیا اور وہ فوراً واپس آ گیا۔ عمران کی واپسی نے گاؤں میں ہلچل مچا دی۔ زینب کی زندگی ایک بار پھر الجھ گئی۔ وہ خوش بھی تھی کہ عمران زندہ ہے، لیکن اس کی موجودہ زندگی میں ایک نئی کشمکش شروع ہو گئی۔ عثمان کو جب اس معاملے کی خبر ملی تو اس نے بڑے سکون سے فیصلہ کیا کہ وہ عمران سے خود بات کرے گا۔ عثمان نے عمران سے ملاقات کی اور پوری حقیقت جانی۔ عمران نے اپنی محبت کا اظہار کیا اور کہا کہ زینب اس کی منگیتر تھی اور وہ اسے واپس چاہتا ہے۔ عثمان نے نہایت تحمل سے جواب دیا، یہ فیصلہ زینب کا ہے۔ وہ جس کے ساتھ خوش رہنا چاہتی ہے، ہم دونوں کو اس کا احترام کرنا ہوگا۔ یہ معاملہ گاؤں کی پنچایت تک پہنچا۔ گاؤں کے بزرگوں نے فیصلہ کیا کہ زینب کو مکمل آزادی دی جائے تاکہ وہ اپنی مرضی سے فیصلہ کرے۔ زینب کے لیے یہ وقت بہت مشکل تھا۔ اس نے کئی راتیں جاگ کر اپنے دل سے سوال کیا۔ وہ عمران کی محبت اور ماضی کے حسین لمحوں کو بھول نہیں پا رہی تھی، لیکن عثمان کی قربانیوں اور محبت کو بھی نظر انداز کرنا اس کے لیے ممکن نہیں تھا۔ زینب کو محسوس ہوا کہ دونوں مرد اپنی جگہ صحیح تھے اور کسی ایک کو چننا بہت مشکل تھا۔ چند دنوں بعد زینب نے پنچایت کے سامنے اپنا فیصلہ سنایا۔ اس نے کہا، عمران میری پہلی محبت تھا اور میں نے ہمیشہ اس کا انتظار کیا۔ لیکن جب زندگی نے مجھے دوسرا راستہ دکھایا تو عثمان نے میرا ساتھ دیا، میری عزت کی اور مجھے ایک نئی زندگی دی۔ میں کسی کو تکلیف دینا نہیں چاہتی، لیکن میرے دل اور ضمیر نے مجھے عثمان کے ساتھ رہنے کا اشارہ دیا ہے، کیونکہ اس نے اپنی محبت کو عمل کے ذریعے ثابت کیا ہے۔ इमरान ने ज़ैनब के फैसले को कबूल किया और गांव छोड़ दिया ताकि वो अपनी ज़िंदगी नए सिरे से शुरू कर सके। ज़ैनब ने उस्मान के साथ अपनी ज़िंदगी को मुकम्मल तौर पर कबूल किया और उसके साथ वफादारी से ज़िंदगी गुजारने लगी। उस्मान ने कभी ज़ैनब से इसके माजी के बारे में सवाल नहीं किया और दोनों ने एक खुशगवार ज़िंदगी का आगाज़ किया। ये कहानी हमें ये सबक देती है कि ज़िंदगी कभी सीधी लकीर की तरह नहीं चलती। बाज़ औक़ात मुश्किल फ़ैसले हमारी राह में आते हैं और हमें उन फ़ैसलों को दिल और दिमाग के साथ कबूल करना होता है। ज़ैनब की ज़िंदगी ने यह साबित किया कि मोहब्बत सिर्फ़ अल्फाज में नहीं बल्कि अमल में होती है, और वही मोहब्बत हकीकी होती है जो मुश्किल वक्त में हमारे साथ खड़ी रहती है।
The House of Eternal Silence. Deep in the heart of the dark, whispering woods, where the sun barely pierced through the skeletal trees and the wind carried strange, cold voices, stood a house that had been abandoned for over 1,000 years. Locals called it the House of Eternal Silence. It was said that no one who dared to enter would ever come out the same, and many whispered that the house itself was alive, a vessel for something ancient and malevolent. The stories of the house had been passed down through generations, becoming more elaborate and terrifying with each retelling. The tales spoke of a noble family, the Everfords, who built the grand estate when the world was still young, and of the dark pact that sealed their fate. No one truly knew what happened to them, but on stormy nights, when the wind howled like a pack of wolves, faint sounds of piano music and the echo of ghostly laughter could be heard from within its rotting halls. Eleanor Blackwood, an ambitious historian with an insatiable thirst for knowledge, was not one to shy away from the unknown. She had spent years studying folklore and legends, writing a thesis on haunted places and the mysteries of the past. The House of Eternal Silence was a story that intrigued her most of all. Driven by a mix of professional curiosity and a hidden desire for adventure, Eleanor decided she would be the one to uncover the truth behind the house's silence. She made her way through the dense woods at dawn, a heavy fog clinging to her ankles like ghostly fingers. The closer she got, the colder the air became, a bite that seemed to seep into her bones. The house loomed before her, its silhouette cast against the pale morning sky, shrouded in ivy and broken stone. Its windows were dark, staring like hollow eyes, and the wooden doors, cracked and warped, looked as if they might crumble to dust at a touch. With a deep breath, Eleanor pushed open the doors and stepped into the unknown. The air inside was thick with the scent of decay and mold, as if the house had exhaled after 1,000 years of silence. The floorboards creaked under her weight, each sound a chorus of mournful whispers. The first room she entered was what once must have been the grand parlor, filled with furniture draped in white sheets. The light from her lantern flickered, casting long, spidery shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. As she moved deeper into the house, she noticed the paintings on the walls. Each portrait was more unsettling than the last, the eyes of the subjects seeming to follow her, their expressions twisted in silent agony. Eleanor reached out to touch one, her fingers brushing against the cracked glass. Suddenly, a cold draft swept through the room, extinguishing her lantern. The silence that followed was deafening. It pressed against her ears, making her heart pound with a sudden, primal fear. "Who dares disturb me?" The voice came from nowhere, yet it felt as though it echoed inside her skull. She spun around, but there was no one there. A shiver coursed down her spine as the temperature dropped even further. The air seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on her as if the house itself were trying to crush her. Panic began to rise, but before she could flee, the floor beneath her buckled, and she tumbled through a hole into darkness. She landed hard, the air knocked from her lungs. Groaning, she forced herself to her feet, her lantern flickering back to life. She was in what appeared to be a hidden basement, the walls lined with ancient runes and symbols that glowed with an eerie, pulsing light. The symbols seemed to move, shifting into grotesque shapes that danced before her eyes. Suddenly, a sound pierced the silence, the faintest notes of piano music. It was as if the keys were being played by invisible hands, producing a melody so haunting that Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The music was beautiful, yet full of sorrow, a lament for the dead. "Leave," a voice whispered from the darkness, as if the shadows themselves had spoken. "Leave before it's too late." Eleanor's heart raced. She stumbled backward, and her foot caught on something cold and metallic. Looking down, she saw an old, rusted chain with a broken shackle. The chain led to a stone altar, and carved into its surface were the words, "In blood we are bound." The music grew louder, more insistent, as if the house were alive and breathing. Eleanor felt the floor shudder beneath her, the walls closing in. She knew she needed to leave, but her legs were frozen, her mind paralyzed by fear. The shadows coalesced into shapes, figures that were once human, twisted and deformed by time and malice. They reached out to her with skeletal fingers, their mouths opening in silent screams. The last thing Eleanor saw before the darkness claimed her was the portrait of the Everford family, their eyes now ablaze with life and hunger. The silent house had finally found a voice, and it was calling her name. The house of eternal silence remained, empty yet never truly abandoned, a curse bound by blood and sorrow, waiting for the next soul daring enough to disturb its peace. Eleanor awoke, her body sprawled across the cold stone floor of the basement. The first rays of dawn filtered through a crack in the wall, bathing the room in pale light. The music had stopped, and the house was still as if nothing had happened at all. For a moment, she wondered if it had all been a dream, but the cold, damp stone beneath her and the throbbing ache in her head told her otherwise. She sat up, her heart pounding as she surveyed her surroundings. The symbols carved into the walls seemed darker now, almost as if they had been freshly etched. They pulsed in the dim light, forming words that whispered in a language long forgotten. "Leave, before the hunger awakens." A chill ran down her spine. Eleanor scrambled to her feet, grabbing the lantern that had rolled across the floor. The flickering flame illuminated a narrow passage leading deeper into the house, one she had not noticed before. It was as if it had been hidden by an invisible wall until now. The air grew colder, and a thin, acrid mist curled around her ankles as she stepped forward. The passage narrowed, forcing her to squeeze through the jagged stone walls, her lantern casting eerie, twisting shadows. At the end, she emerged into a cavernous room filled with echoes and an unnatural silence. This room was unlike anything she had ever seen. Its ceiling arched high above her, supported by ancient, blackened columns inscribed with cryptic runes. The floor was covered in shattered glass, bones, and relics, all scattered like the remnants of some long-forgotten ritual. At the center of the room stood an altar, identical to the one she had seen in the basement but much larger. It was stained with blood that seemed to shimmer in the dim light, almost alive as if it had never dried. Eleanor's pulse quickened when she realized that she was not alone. Figures stood motionless in the corners of the room, their shapes obscured by shadow. They were the spirits of the Everford family, their pale, translucent forms chained to the walls, eyes hollow and vacant, their mouths agape as if forever screaming in torment. "You have awakened it," one of the figures said. It was Lady Everford, her voice a whisper carried by the wind. She had once been beautiful, her eyes a piercing blue, but now they were as empty as the house itself, reflecting only darkness. Eleanor's mind spun with questions, but her fears silenced them all. What are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We were the ones who made the pact," Lady Everford replied, stepping forward, her ghostly figure flickering like a dying flame. "1,000 years ago, we thought we could claim power over death. We never knew that the house in return would claim us." The room seemed to shrink as Eleanor's horror deepened. She noticed now that some of the relics scattered across the floor were not relics at all but the remains of previous victims. Skulls with eyes wide open, hands clutching at the air as if trying to escape their fate. "The hunger waits," Lady Everford whispered, pointing to the altar. "It is fed by those who dare to enter, those who disturb the silence. You are the last, the final soul bound to it." Eleanor backed away, her heart thundering as a low, guttural growl resonated from beneath the altar. The stones shuddered, and the blood began to writhe as if it were alive, spreading in rivulets that traced patterns of decay across the floor. The chains that bound the spirits clattered and rattled as if in anticipation, and Eleanor realized with a sickening jolt that the house itself was waking, stretching its terrible ancient limbs. The silence was no longer a passive state, it was a hunger, a thirst for life that could not be quenched. Eleanor reached for the lantern, but before she could move, a figure appeared in the doorway, tall, with eyes that glowed a piercing, unnatural red. It was neither man nor beast, but something in between, something that had waited for a millennium. The air around it was hot and suffocating, the scent of iron and decay cloying in Eleanor's nostrils. "It is time," it whispered, its voice a chorus of echoes, 1,000 voices speaking in unison. "You have come, and now you will never leave." The spirits of the Everford family screamed as one, their anguish filling the room and drowning out the growl of the house. The ground quaked beneath Eleanor's feet, and she stumbled, the lantern falling and shattering into pieces, casting the room into darkness. A cold, ghostly wind swept through the room, and a laugh, deep and terrible, echoed from the shadows. The house had claimed her, just as it had claimed all those before her, forever waiting for the next soul to wander in and break the silence. Outside, the wind picked up again, howling like a beast in torment. The woods stood silent, the morning sun rising behind the dark, twisted trees. But in that silence, deep in the heart of the forest, the house waited, its hunger sated for now, biding its time until the next unwitting soul dared to trespass. And the legends of the House of Eternal Silence continued, whispered in hushed voices, a warning to all who would listen. The days turned into weeks, and the forest surrounding the House of Eternal Silence remained unchanged, a shadowed, unyielding expanse of gnarled trees and tangled roots. Birds never sang, and the wind only whispered dark secrets as it passed. But deep within the house, something had shifted. It was no longer just a structure of decay and silence. It had become something more, an entity hungry for the memories, souls, and fears of those who dared to step inside. Eleanor's fate had become part of the house's dark history. Her name was whispered in the echoes of the halls, mingling with the voices of the Everford family and the many others who had come before her. The spirits of the house now moved with more purpose, a chorus of suffering that thrummed through the halls, their moans and wails carrying on the wind. But they were no longer just passive entities. They were like the strings of an orchestra, under the will of something ancient and sentient. Time passed in twisted, nonlinear ways within the house. It was as if each room held a different chapter, a different era, locked in its own timeless loop. One moment, the grand parlor would be lit by the glow of a hearth and filled with the sounds of laughter and music. In the next, it was a shadowed, cobwebbed hall, where the cold seeped from the walls and the air was heavy with the scent of decay. The house shifted and breathed, moving its walls, whispering secrets in a language no mortal could understand. But one evening, under the pale moonlight, a figure approached the house. This time, it was not an unknowing traveler, but a man with eyes that reflected the cold light of the stars and a voice as rough as gravel. His name was Isaac Harlow, a renowned exorcist who had heard rumors of the House of Eternal Silence from an old, half-mad priest in a forgotten village. Isaac's father had once been a priest who disappeared while investigating an ancient curse, and Isaac had spent his life seeking answers, driven by a thirst for truth and vengeance. Isaac stood at the threshold of the house, feeling the temperature drop as if the house itself exhaled. The doors, heavy with rust and decay, creaked open, beckoning him into the darkness. The silence that met him was more profound than anything he had ever known, pressing against his eardrums and making his heart race. He took a step inside, and the house groaned, its walls shifting as though recognizing his presence. He made his way through the parlor, the floorboards creaking under his boots. The air was thick, laden with the scent of rotting wood and something sweeter and more dangerous, a lingering presence that clung to him like a shroud. The flickering moonlight cast long shadows, and Isaac could almost see figures moving in the corners of his eyes. Spirits of the damned, trapped in this prison of walls and memories. As he advanced, whispers began to form words, voices calling to him, crying for release or begging for oblivion. He tightened his grip on the staff in his hand, an artifact of ash and iron, imbued with blessings from the farthest reaches of the earth. The staff thrummed with a faint, blue light, the only light in the suffocating darkness. Isaac Harlow, a voice boomed from the depths of the house, deep and resonant. It was neither human nor spectral but carried the weight of countless centuries. Why do you disturb me? You cannot banish what has never lived. Isaac's blood ran cold, but he stood firm. I am here to free the souls bound to this place, to end this curse. The house shuddered, the walls splitting with a sound like thunder. The floor cracked, revealing the deep, gaping chasm beneath, from which a red light shone and whispers rose, sharp and hungry. You know not the cost of what you seek, the voice whispered, but it was no longer a single entity. It was a chorus, a cacophony of agony. From the cracks emerged shadows, twisting figures with eyes that glowed with a sickly yellow light. They were not human but twisted effigies of the dead, with outstretched limbs and mouths that roared in silent agony. Isaac raised his staff, summoning the power within. By the light of all that is sacred, I command you to be silenced, he shouted. The staff's glow grew brighter, illuminating the room with a searing light that cut through the darkness. The shadows recoiled, shrieking in pain as the blue light seared through them. They dispersed, but a deep, reverberating laughter, low and guttural, swept through the house. You cannot banish what is already in you, the voice whispered again, but this time Isaac heard it in his mind. It spoke of his father's disappearance, of the night Isaac had discovered the journal with the ritual that could have saved him, but which instead cursed him forever. Isaac's mind spun, the lines between reality and the horrors of the house blurring. He stumbled, but as he caught himself, he noticed something. The altar in the basement was no longer just an artifact of history. It had become a doorway, a portal to the realm of the house's true master. He needed to close it before the house consumed him, before he too became another whisper in its unending chorus. Taking a deep breath, he ran back to the basement, past the twisted figures and spirits clawing at him, their voices pleading for salvation and damnation in equal measure. He reached the altar just as the ground cracked open, the red light pouring like blood into the room, and something dark, something larger than anything he could comprehend, began to rise. Isaac gripped his staff, knowing that the final battle would not be fought with weapons or exorcism alone. It would be fought with his will, his sacrifice. And as the darkness reached out with shadowy fingers, Isaac whispered the prayer that would either end it all or consume him forever. The house screamed, a sound so loud it split the earth. The spirits wailed, their forms dissolving into the red light as it consumed them. And then, as quickly as it began, there was silence. The red light dimmed, and the shadows retreated, leaving only the hushed whispers of 1,000 souls and the echo of Isaac's final breath. The house stood silent once more, but it was no longer the same. The door creaked open, the morning sun streaming in, bright and blinding. The woods stood as they had for centuries, unmoving, watchful. But the whispers had stopped. The hunger had been sated, for now. As the last echoes of Isaac's voice faded into the silence, the house trembled, its ancient stones shuddering as if gasping for breath. The altar, now scorched and cracked, lay as a solemn reminder of the battle that had just taken place. The red light had disappeared, and the dark, roiling mist that had once choked the house dissipated, leaving only the musty, stale air and a profound, unsettling quiet. The spirits of the Everford family, once bound to the walls, were now freed from their chains. They lingered in the space between life and death, their figures shimmering like thin, pale smoke. For a moment, they seemed at peace, their expressions less tormented, their eyes no longer hollow but filled with a strange, muted gratitude. Then, as the first rays of dawn spilled through the cracked walls and shattered windows, a deep, mournful sigh echoed through the house. It came not from any living being but from the house itself. It was as though the building had exhaled the weight of its 1,000-year existence, a heavy, shuddering release. And then it was still eerily so. The malevolence that had once been so palpable seemed to have been vanquished, leaving behind only a solemn, haunted beauty. The forest outside, too, began to change. The dead branches that had hung like skeletal fingers seemed to soften, their sharp angles rounding into smoother shapes. The damp soil, so dark and unwelcoming, shifted into earth that felt less suffocating. The wind, once cold and whispering with dark secrets, now carried a strange, sweet scent of pine and morning dew. It was as if the house had released its hold on the land, allowing the forest to breathe again. But Isaac's sacrifice had come at a cost. In the clearing where he had faced the darkness, a thin, translucent figure now stood, clothed in the tattered robes of a priest. It was Isaac himself, no longer bound to the mortal world but not entirely a spirit either. His eyes, once fierce with determination, now held a hint of peace, even as they glistened with unshed tears. He was a guardian, a warden bound to the house and its secrets, a figure who would forever stand as a reminder of the price of curiosity and bravery. The forest began to whisper once more, but this time it was not a tale of horror. It spoke of hope, of redemption. It spoke of the man who had dared to confront the darkness and save the lost souls of the house. The air carried the stories of those who had ventured into the woods before, adding Isaac's tale to the legends that would echo for centuries. Years passed, and the house of eternal silence remained, but it was no longer the same. It was no longer just a tomb of forgotten memories. People spoke of its new presence, of how the very walls seemed to breathe with an aura of quiet vigilance, as if awaiting the next visitor who might learn its secrets. The whispers were no longer only of dread, there was now a hint of gratitude, of peace. The spirits of the Everford family sometimes appeared at the windows, looking out with eyes that seemed to know that the house was no longer a prison but a place of final rest. The forest around the house grew tall and thick, shrouded in a soft, green light. The path that led to it became hidden by ivy and wildflowers, and the air was filled with the song of birds. The legend of the house changed from one of terror to one of mystery, a place that both called to and warned away those who sought its stories. But now the woods spoke of Isaac Harlow as well, the man who faced the darkness so others would not have to. And so, the house of eternal silence continued to stand as it always had, against the winds and the rain. But within it now lived not just the echoes of the past, but also the hope of redemption. It was a place where one could still hear the whispers of spirits, where the air was filled with both the weight of what had happened and the promise of what could be. And in the clearing, where Isaac stood with eyes cast to the horizon, the wind carried a single word, one that would never fade from the forest or from the house itself.